Bonjour, everyone.
Bonjour. Hello.
It's a great pleasure. My name is Brian Kwan-Wood. I'm the Director of Research here at MA Curatorial Practice at the School of Visual Arts. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Nadia Yala Kisukidi and Claire Tancons. Today, I'm sorry for the delay. Thank you very much to everyone for your patience. As the maybe it's too much information, but as the description for our event says, as she settles in France after nearly 2 decades working in the US, Claire is still settling in France and has had some internet issues, so has had to sort of zip over to Yala's house to join us there. So thank you for your patience. Well, as she settles in France, a distinguished curator, Claire Tancons, has been considering how France's foundational Republican ideals and contemporary multicultural experience rub against each other through the lens of American race theory and identity politics, recently demonized by factions within France's higher education system and at the upper levels of the Republic itself. She is joined by French philosopher Nadia Yala Kisukidi, who is curator of the 2021 Yango Biennale in Kinshasa, who has examined the colonial implications of blackness in France and Europe, not necessarily in the sense of the term in North American contexts. Yala is working on is about to release an upcoming book together with Jamila Ribeiro from Brazil on the subject. So we have done some improvising and gotten it together. Yala described this as rock and roll. It's a real pleasure to have you two heroic working mothers also here with us today. And I think also in case there are any child needs, we might have to also improvise something for that. No problem. Great. I will hand it over to Claire, I think. No?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all of you who are joining us online. It is a little after 6 p.m. here in France. It is just such a pleasure to be next to Yala, whom I am encountering for the first time, even though in many ways I have been in conversation with her and best known to her for as long as I have begun to form the idea of returning to France. Yala is among a younger generation of Afro-diasporic thinkers who gave me the desire to return back to France to do the work that maybe I escaped doing 20 years ago when I left after my studies. But this aside, one of the ways in which we began our conversation with Brian, and as we also started to discuss Yala, is that I was really displeased by reporting from the New York Times about the way in which the French were balking at so-called dangerous American ideas coming from the university, and the way in which it rocked not only the Minister of Education and it's the Minister of Education, but also the French president himself, who somehow was convoked into giving his opinion on the matter. And I was really dumbfounded. And at the same time, I did not want to go into an imprecation against the French, having just left the US to settle in France. And I think that with Yala, we early on decided to try and break away from this binary that will be castigating one country over the other and look instead for dialectical links in the way in which they have historically existed. And so one of the ideas that we've been kind of toying with together is that of the so-called Lafayette Louverture complex. Indeed, in thinking about these early historical linkages between France and the United States, I immediately began to think about Marquis De Lafayette, who you may know as the hero of two worlds, the young aristocrat who became alongside, well, under the guidance of Washington, one of the heroes of the American Revolution, only to also become a hero of the French Revolution back in France. So this is for an early and very brief and very summary a historical reminder of the great kinship that once linked the France and the US, the United States of America, in ways that continue, I think, to inform our relationships and what we want to make of them, given that they are indeed grounded within these revolutionary ideals. But then there is another hero of another revolution who came to mind, also related to America, but to the Americas, and that is, of course, Toussaint Louverture. And Toussaint has come to be known as this dramatic figure betrayed by Bonaparte, as we know, imprisoned and left to die in Fort de Joux. But I think that he's an interesting figure through which to think this linkage between France and the Americas, rather than simply the United States of America, especially from an African diasporic perspective, which is that which interests us today, because Yala and I, and Yala very much, and for quite some time, as she will tell us from the French side, we're trying to think about what is it that prevents the French from fully embracing diversity, alterity, which doesn't really translate in English, I suppose, but l'altérité. And what are the foundations, theoretical, philosophical, that lead to this situation we're in now, which seems a countercurrent with the efforts that are currently underway in the US, where great strides are made towards restoring some sort of a, or not restoring, but bringing some form of a balance, especially as concerned representation and diversity within the art and cultural field, with the appointment of leading African diasporic figures at the head or at the upper echelons of American institutions. So Yala, I wanted to know, what is it that you've been working on in trying to bring about the ideas that underpin this resistance, this French resistance towards, well, seemingly towards making the leap to bringing about a balance that would better represent the diversity of French society?
Yeah, I think that there are several answers and several analyses to make to be able just to figure out how we can think about those resistances. First, if we have to just analyze the contemporary moment we are living in, I think that there is a kind of a very famous category that I like to use just to understand this moment. It is a category that was created by Paul Gilroy, but just to explain what was happening in Great Britain 20 years ago. And the way he's explaining what was happening in Great Britain 20 years ago is quite similar to what we are just facing in France, even if it's a complete different context. And he has this concept that can seem perhaps old, but that is still relevant if you want to understand what is happening in France. This is the context of post-colonial melancholia. And here I think that in France we are facing such a French post-colonial melancholia. That is to say that a kind of it's not a new discourse, but a political discourse that is crossing, I think, the left and the right to the far right, is trying to bind together nation, culture, and race. And now we have to face such a kind of a discourse that completely destroys all the possibilities to be able to see how the difference in itself can be seen as a wealth and not as something like as a separatism or a murderous, a murderous will. So this concept of Gilroy is interesting because I think that now there is a kind of a there are a lot of hysterical discourses that are using the notion of race to understand all the political situation. It can be about justice issues, educational issues, cultural issues. Everything is seen towards the veil of the race in my country now. And I think that just to use, I mean, Paul Gilroy's concept, I think that we are able to make a kind of colonial genealogy, perhaps, of this, of what is happening now. That's why it is possible to call that a kind of post-colonial melancholia. We were a great empire. We had power upon all those people, the others, and now they reclaim the same rights as us. And just there is I love Jean-Paul Sartre. Sorry, I can be very, very caricatural sometimes. But there is, you know, in this very famous text called the colonialism is a system. I mean, le colonialisme est un système. You have a part in this text where Sartre explain why the question, the principles of republic, the principles of equality, or the principles of equality, freedom, and fraternity do completely destroy themselves or melt when they are faced to the colonial situation. And that's interesting just to see how he demonstrates that.
Yes, you know, I think that this is in keeping with what has often been said about the way in which the Haitian Revolution is actually the further advanced version of what the French Revolution should have been, having taken into consideration precisely these colonial and racial entanglements, which would have led to the actual completion of those French ideals with which we wrestle so much. Now, because we are here at SVA, if remotely from Ivry, it is again our interest to somehow find a way to bring this debate back around to the art world, which we both and all inhabit, and I think that this will give us an idea as to the way in which the French approach matters of diversity in bringing about, as the rest of the American and Anglo-Saxon world does, in bringing about figures from the African diaspora, for instance, or from other diasporas, but in manners that are not touted and announced and instrumentalized as such in the way that they might be in the US. And so one of the things that came to my attention is that recently, over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, there's been 3 appointments of prominent figures in national institutions. And those 3, just to highlight them, but there are others, there might be others as well. There's been Emmanuel Cazereroux as the new president of the Musée du Quai Branly, which, as you know, is the institution devoted to the so-called Art Premier, or previously known as primitive arts, to do with Oceania and Africa and Asia primarily, well, the non-Western world. There is Pape Ndiaye, who is the head of the National Museum of Immigration, Palais de la Porte Dorée. And there is even more recently Dominique Taffin, who is the head of the newly founded Fondation pour la Mémoire de l'Esclavage, or Foundation for the Memory of Slavery. And so the 3 figures on the face of it, quite literally, are Black, quote unquote. And I can just imagine about how, you know, Culture Type, to name one of these American online magazine that has made it a mission to check every time there's a new Black nominee at this and that other post. I could just imagine a Culture Type article touting how the leaders of 3 national institutions in French are in fact Black. But then if you look at it, Emmanuel Cazereroux is Kanak, Dominique Taffin is Guadeloupean, and Pape Ndiaye is Senegalese. And truthfully, we all know that they are somehow linked with each other by way of the French colonial history. But isn't that actually a good thing that the French wouldn't lump them all as just Black? Because again, what really links this Guadeloupean woman, this Kanak man, and this Senegalese man together? So this is the terrain that I want us to to be in, to complexify the way in which what may seem as French backwardedness is in fact a measure of a perhaps more subtle approach to the matter of diversity. And I leave it to you, Yala, to think about what I have just kind of brought about in a semi-controversial manner.
Yeah, it's, I think also, I'm sorry, just to start this way, it's also a difficult question because there are many things in your question. First, we could say perhaps that it's a good thing if we don't mention their blackness. I mean, they're just here because, I mean, they are to be at the head of great institutions. And why should we mention their blackness? I mean, it's not because they are not higher there, they are not at the head of those institutions because they are Black, but just because I think they have all the things they need just to be able to give some new path, some new ways to those institutions that sometimes are very old and that have to be renewed. But at the same time, when you are in a country where you have a kind of when you have a lot of resistances to changes, when you have a lot of racial bias that are completely that undermine sometimes the ways people want to live and want to build their own dreams. I think we should say that now we have perhaps 3 Black persons that can be, I mean, role models for the others. But we are in this situation in France, where I think that the first thing I said, we don't have to mention that they are Black, is a good thing. But at the same time, as we are in a country where the racial bias are really heavy and that those people are perhaps exceptions, we have to mention it. So I think that it is a kind of anti-racism must be seen. We have to understand, I don't know if I will be clear about that, but I can try to explain it in a more theoretical way. But I think that when we fight against racism, we are always inhabiting an aporia. The aporia that we have to erase race, and that's why we are fighting racism, because we don't want, I mean, our lives to be built by a racial order. But at the same time, if you want to fight the question of racism, you have to affirm or just to show that you are a part of those people that have contributed to the wealthiness and to the richness, to the value of this world. So I think that in the question of in the Black issue, it's impossible to escape from this aporia, to be in the affirmation of Blackness and at the same time to call for the dismantlement of Blackness. And I think that, for example, we have a great French school, I don't know if we can say that, I mean, in French, great trend of ideas that comes in the 30s. I'm sorry, it's very classical, but it's the school of the trend of the negritude. Mm-hmm. And I think that when you read Léopold Sédar Senghor, even Césaire, they are completely aware of this aporia, of the fact that the word negritude in itself is a real problem, because you have to escape from the question of race. You have to erase Blackness, but at the same time to reclaim it. And we are always facing that. And I think that in France, I don't know how is the situation in the US, but I think that in France, for example, the tradition we have with the Republican universalism just show us how we have to deal with the question of anti-racism, and we have to deal with this aporia. And I think that's the best way to understand the complexity of what racism is.
Yes, when you were talking about the aporia of race, we have to somehow reckon with. It made me think about Pape Ndiaye, who we mentioned earlier, and who we hope will contribute to a greater convening around this topic that may be hosted. Well, I don't know if I should disclose, Brian, but in any case, we're working on something somehow with greater reach, if you will, and Pape will be hopefully one of our discussants. But Pape Ndiaye was, well, actually not so long ago, but was commenting on the way in which the word race was removed from the French Constitution. Yeah. And for the French, to remove the word race from the French Constitution is to make an act of anti-racism. It is to say, well, if we remove the word, we remove the issue. And Pape was arguing, well, in fact, not, because we have to understand race as a historically and socially constructed matter. Now, I say this to you guys over there in the US, and I know this is so 101 that you're just like, oh my God. But it is true. In France, we are still discussing the way in which we should or should not use the word race. And then folk think that by just removing the word, you're removing the issue. So this is kind of what we're dealing with. Now,
that's magical.
It's magical thinking, yes. Now, I know, Yala, that you also want to talk about the synecdotal approach to the concept of universalism. But before we do so, and to go back to what you were saying earlier about whether it is or not a good thing to kind of brand these highly qualified and indeed best candidates for the jobs. And we could go on to just reviewing their resumes. I mean, they've all gone to the so-called grandes écoles, so their pedigree is beyond question. And so being French, as you are, I would tend to also think, well, it might be good not to have to mention that they are also, but I think that it is this and again, this aporia that we have to work on. And I think that one of the reasons why, to bring matters to a political level, I think that one of the reasons why the French refrain from doing so might just as well has to do with the fact that in order to be able to build counterpowers, you have to be able to recognize each other. You have to be able to somehow find a communal ground. And I think that it is just another way to fail to recognize common interests that, if coming together, might actually propose something that can begin to dismantle precisely that for universalism that I know you can explain much better than I. And I think that this political, the political underpinnings of the reasons why the French refrain from creating these categories has everything to do with representation. And in preparing for our conversation, Yala, I reached back to the work of one of our great mentors and one of the other African diasporic French women who really made me want to come back to France, and that is the great art historian Anne Lafont. And Anne Lafont, if you don't know her book yet, but you will, and it should be translated in English. I have it in my bag, but I won't look for it. But Anne Lafont wrote this fantastic book, L'art et la race, l'Africain tout contre l'œil de lumière. I won't translate Art and Race, the African, well, close to the eye of les Lumières. And in that book, she has a chapter devoted to Toussaint. And there comes Louverture again. And she goes on to showing how, unlike other revolutionary leaders of his class and might, Toussaint was represented in secondary media, certainly not in grand heroic paintings. So he was represented as a hero just fine, but in prints, I mean, again, not in the kind of heroic formats, which at the time would have contributed to his greater recognition. And I think that with these contemporary Black figures who might be given, or mind you, who might have won access to these positions, there's this process of invisibilization that is at work. And the word invisibilization or visibilization is used by Anne in order to bring about this political agenda which is behind these forms of representation. And so again, why is it that we have to struggle so hard to find Black representations in France, even when it exists.
They exist.
They exist.
They
but again,
exist.
there is a process of invisibilization
Of
that
course.
is at play.
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned is important, because we exactly we are just facing exactly the same thing in the intellectual history, and especially in the philosophical history.
Yeah.
And I remember there was a symposium 2 years, I mean, before the COVID at the Collège de France. I think you were there too.
Yes.
About the question of the restitutions. And the debate about is it possible to restitute or not those objects that were taken from the African continent during the colonization has focused, as I said, around the question of the universalism. But what is interesting is that if people had just an idea of what is the intellectual history of France, they could have seen that those debates had already taken part in the 50s, while all the Black people from all around the world had met, when the Black people from all around the world had met at the Sorbonne during the Congrès des artistes, des écrivains, des artistes. And it was interesting to see that, for example, this Congrès, which is something absolutely huge in the intellectual history, has there is no memory, or there is no, I don't know if people even know in France that it had existed, but it was one of the biggest intellectual moments of the 50s. And it is interesting to see how those events, how those characters are seen like as the characters that are the others. This is the story of the others. This is not our story. This is, for example, when you see the question of slavery, you have the impression that I mean, France was not a power that was completely engaged in the slave trade. They have the impression that it belongs to the past, and that it is not the French history. And it is interesting to see how French people, how we do, I mean, in France, I say we because I'm French, but how do we create our national identity, or how do we create this, what we call this national novel, by erasing all the histories of minorities or people that are targeted as minorities, and what kind of a very conformist and homogeneous history are we creating. And it's true to say that I think that to understand the reason why, the reason of those invisibilization that is at the core, I think, of this discussion, that's complex. We could say that's the revolution and the republicanism, but as you said, there were really radical expressions of revolutionary republicanism. You talked about Toussaint, but we could talk about the revolutions also that we had in France. I mean, 1848 or even La Commune were examples of real radical republicanism, where we had to redefine all the frontiers. But you also have a very conservative republicanism that is dominant now, but you also have conservative movements that have been invisibilized at the same way, but you see that they are still very heavy and very strong in our society. I think, for example, of the idea, for example, of the far right. We all thought that, I think, anti-Semitism or that, I don't know, hard racism had completely disappeared from the political landscape, but they have not. And you still have very conservative people. We could see that during when they wanted to create this law for the people of the same sex so they can get married, and you saw so many people in the street with very conservative and reactionary arguments, that you say all those people are living in this republic. So what is this country? How can we understand the complexity and the heterogeneity of this country that is completely erased under the idea that we are all the same? We all have to erase our difference under a certain abstract conceptions of what citizenship is. Yes. And to me, it's I think we can make colonial genealogies, of course. We can make genealogies that are rooted in the history of slave trade, of course. But we have to, what is really difficult with the French country is to understand how heterogeneous this country is, and how, I mean, those languages of, I don't know, perhaps republicanism is sometimes just erasing all those heterogeneity. And to me, I think this country is still surprising. And when I see some expressions of violence, of reactionary violence, I always say, I'm always surprised by these types of expression, not because I don't know that there is systemic racism in this country or things like that, but because I see that there is something that is rooted in a very long and such a very complex history that it's always surprising. For example, the way the languages of a very conservative Catholicism is still present and relevant for many people in a country that says that it is completely laic, and that the religion that cannot shape, I mean, the way we are living. That's,
I think Yala, that it is precisely because we are lacking a common ground in terms of having the means to express, and we haven't formed a discourse in the way in which I think America and Anglo-Saxon countries have around race, through which we can express ourselves, which is why there are these outbursts of violence. But I want to go back to many of the things that you said. For the record, la loi pour le mariage pour tous. So this is the law for to allow for gay marriage. Well, it is to be noted that it was supported by the greatest ever Christiane Taubira, a Black woman from Guyane, one-time presidential candidate, and then the minister of la ministre de la Justice.
exactly, yeah.
So really, so just for the record, just to mention the great figure of Christiane Taubira, so that's just one thing I wanted to say. And it is to see again how this alliance of quote unquote minority can happen, and how it was in this case channeled by this Black woman, which is something that I thought was quite extraordinary from a French standpoint. So that's just as for the record. Now, there is something that you said about the way in which the French, it is as if the French totally deteriorized the matter of slavery and colonization
Exactly.
and race.
Exactly.
We all know that, unlike in the US, slavery did not take place in hexagonal France,
Exactly,
if
yeah.
you will, but in the colonies across from the Mediterranean, or the colonies across from the Atlantic and Oceanic, Indian Ocean, sorry. But at the same time, and I don't know if I shared this with you, but this was an image that really struck me. The great grand historian Benjamin Stora, one of the few who works towards thinking together both the Antillean problem and the Algerian question, at a colloquium in New York from a few years ago. The colloquium was framed thus: when will France have its Barack Obama? This is like, okay, well, actually, France has its Barack Obama. It's Christiane Taubira. I just said it. Okay, so that was the title of the colloquium, rhetorical as the question was. And there was a great array of some fantastic French and American kind of post-colonial thinkers, among which Benjamin Stora and Pape Ndiaye on the French side. And the whole event was convened at Albertine, the library of the French consulate on Fifth Avenue. And the whole event was convened by, oh dear, I'm blanking his name. This is such a shame, never mind. But to go to my point, Benjamin Stora at this convening said in French, and it was translated, the French too had their revolutionary, their secession war, ont eu leur guerre de sécession. This is the way in which we call the War of Independence in France. And it was the Algerian War. And when he said that, knowing that Algeria is, as we know, across from the Mediterranean, it brought home the way in which French colonialism was so tight that in fact it is as if the French had lived colonization as if on the same continent. The Mediterranean was just kind of like a fleuve. It was just like a river. I mean, we just thought we were Algerian just like the Algerians were French. This was really so striking when Benjamin Stora, making the great historical and geographical leak that he did, said this. The French too had their secessionary war, and it was the Algerian War. So again, this is to say how this deteriorization has no business to be, because in fact, the fabrica of French colonialism, which was once very kind of coarsely defined as being integrationist as opposed to more emancipatory on the English side. I mean, the way in which the French colonials were really made to think that they were French and they actually thought it, whereas, you know, the Nigerians never thought they were British. I mean, you know, they knew, anyhow, this all has to do in the way in which the British kept the tribal system, in the way in which the French dismantled it. And this is all too vulgarly summarized, but I think you can follow me. So, so this is something that I wanted to say about this deteriorization of the matter of slavery, colonization, and today race, and the way in which it goes against the grain of the very skin deep feelings that the French feel about the former colonized populations. And there is a third point I wanted to make, but maybe I lost it. But there's yet another one that I'm picking up. And I like to say, Yala, and to kind of bring the point home, that as a Guadeloupean, we Guadeloupeans folks on the island of Guadeloupe, Martinicans the same, have been French since 1635. The French were, the Guadeloupe and Martinique were settled as French colonies in 1635, which is to say that Antilleans, these overseas African diasporic French folk to be, well, now to be French, have actually been French for longer than some of the other French regions.
Yeah,
and I won't name which, but because now my historical weaknesses will show, but you know, when is it that really Corsica and Brittany and XYZ, you know, actually became, or Alsace-Lorraine, not to mention. So, so this is the very diverse geographical and historical ground with which we're wrestling, and which has us wondering, why is it that this great grand mantle of universalism continues to preclude the very debates we need having in order for these outbursts of violence to be somehow dismantled before they arise. And I think that it all has to do with language and discourse and the tools that we haven't yet formed in order to be able to express ourselves differently.
But it's interesting because the question of deterritorialization, say it with a French accent, it's easier.
Yeah.
Because I think that we have to, what we are facing now is that in fact, all the debates and the violent debates we have around the question of race in France is targeting especially the young people that have been, that are born in France, but from, I mean, African descent. That is to say, the post-colonial immigration, even if this expression is not relevant in itself. But it's interesting because what the debates are saying is that they are renewing the kind of arguments you could find during the slave trade and during the colonization, is that the slave cannot be a parent. Says this, you can find in the book of a great book that I love.
Je ne trouve pas de lieu de consommation de cannabis.
The historian Aurélia Michel has written a book very interesting, Le Monde en Nègre et Blanc, and she shows how the question of the definition of the slave is that the slave cannot be your parent. There is no filiation possible with the slave. And this idea of parenthood has renewed itself in the colonial order. And now what you see in the political discourses that are targeting, for example, young people perceived as Black or Arab or Muslim in France, is that if those people are just proud of their blackness, of their Muslim religions, it means that they cannot be our parents. They cannot be French. They are anti-French. So we still have this question of parenthood that is rooted in the question of colonialism, and in the question of slavery, that is in the question of the racial order. And that is to say, can we be their parents? That is to say, are we able to create also and to renew, to redefine what could be a kind of a French genealogy, or being able to build a French family, to be part of the French family. And that is at the core of the idea of fraternity. Can we be brother? And those debates say, no, you cannot be our brothers.
Now, you know, Yala, and I'm keeping an eye on the clock, but no, this is great. I didn't know this author. I'm thinking about Hortense Spiller, but of course, linkages could be made with the way in which she wrote about precisely matters of filiation and genealogy. And I think that the answer maybe to the question you posed earlier, or to the way in which you framed our conversation with this idea of post-colonial melancholia. And I think that the answer is to do with the ability that we will have to build these genealogies. And as we know, if we're talking about parenting, and if we're talking about actually who are today's French children, they are mixed and they are diverse. And they are I mean, as we know, at times when, you know, segregation made interracial marriages dangerous in the US, African Americans, especially soldiers from World War I and through World War II, and of course, African American thinkers from the Harlem Renaissance on, found a haven of peace in France. I was just reading this great book. Oh, and this is one of the points I wanted to make earlier, since let's switch to literature a bit. I was just reading this fantastic, well, I don't know that it's fantastic, but it's fantastic because it finally appeared, a Claude Mackay book, the manuscript of which was thought to have been lost. It's called Romance à Marseille, and it is published for the first time in a French translation by a small French publisher. And Claude Mackay was part of this formidable conglomerate of African diasporic and Africans from around the world in Marseille, right? Yes. And so, but
can I just say something? Yeah, I think what you say is really interesting, because I made a paper. I mean, I wrote a text called Racial Hospitality. I mean, and it was a text that I wrote when I came back from the US, because I stayed in New York for 1 year. I mean, when I was a postdoctoral researcher. And I remember that it was interesting to see and to understand my literature experiences. When you read Baldwin, when you read even Ta-Nehisi Coates, and
Ta-Nehisi was the convener of the Albertine stuff.
And when you read that Between the World and Me, you can see how, for example, the city of Paris was a way to escape from the discourse of race. And it's interesting as a French Black persons to understand the way they are living their Parisian experience and the way I was living my New Yorker experience, like other French Black people. I remember the kind of discourses, for example, Maboula Soumaoro can have in her book Le Triomphe des Hexagones. And it's funny to see that, for example, when you are French, you see a kind of emancipatory process in the ability of just saying that you are Black and to be recognized as Black.
Yeah, I wrote about this.
And it's very, so you have all those torn experiences. I mean, universalism in itself could be seen as emancipatory. And of course, we could say, great, in this country, when they say race has nothing to do in the Republic, I think is the best expression of what emancipation could be. But it's not working at all.
No.
Because you have to face race everywhere, I think, in France, when you walk, when you fell in love. I mean, this is an experience, an everyday life experience. And it was funny to see that when I went to the US and when I had all those discussions with intellectual French Black thinker, the fact that race was so visible, it was sometimes perhaps easier to escape from it and to be able to be creative and to create your own life. So we were completely torn into those experiences between a kind of utopian universalism that has completely fallen apart, and a country that is completely destroyed by race and racism, and at the fact it was easier to find your own freedom in this violence than in the Republican utopia. So that's I think the delirium, and also the violence of what racism is. How can we explain that it is easier to live in a country that is completely, I mean, I could not say that because you have, we die. I mean, race kills people, but those torn experiences just show the toxicity of racism and the impossibility to escape from this aporia I was talking at the beginning of our conversation.
Yes. So Yala, this will be for another discussion. The American experience of a Black French person, a very suspect individual, often, because of the inability to really reckon with the notion of race and to be recognized as part of the greater African diasporic family, if you will, precisely because of not, of course, the Blackness of our skins, but the Frenchness of our nationhood. But that's somewhat of a well-known debate. Now, what I wanted to say when you said that race was central, in a way to the French experience, but also to the revolutionary ideals that failed on both the Haitian and the French side. As I said earlier, the Haitian Revolution could have been seen as the epitome, as the epitome of what the French Constitution when it was written. And you know, one of the things that I was thinking recently, and I haven't had a chance yet to think through further, is the way in which French revolutionary ideals anyway have survived maybe within the French people, in the sense le peuple, and we feel this with all the recent movements which are unfortunately billed as reactionary, and that's maybe les gilets jaunes, or just with the French tendency to go on strike and this and that, and all of which we're very much laughed at by the rest of the world.
This is something I like in my country.
No, of course, we all do love it. A little bit of carnivalesque to bring on another one of my favorite topics. But how these revolutionary ideals, if it may have stayed, if on that somewhat superficial carnivalesque form with the French people, it totally disappeared from the governmental structures that did all but reinstate a form of an autocratic and regalist power. I mean, the French president is a monarch. I mean, has monarchic powers in ways that I find striking, having recently returned and being all too new to really being able to express political views, but to look back to where we began. I mean, to be shocked that the French president would have a say in dangerous academic ideas, or that the French president would be the one appointing the head of national museums. I mean, this is like, wow, I forgot. I mean, so it's all so much tied.
Yeah, but here, this is how you see that we are in a very difficult situation. I'm not sure it is the first time, but for the first time, we had a president that was able to use his power to target people and to weaken the institutions, the Republican institutions. So it's very we don't have to forget that we are also a very Republican country in the French sense, but also a neoliberal country, and that neoliberalism and republicanism are completely contradictory ideas at the same time. So that's why you can understand that you have the Republican discourses that is very heavy, that is very that is used by all the politicians, and that is transforming itself into a racial discourse. But you also have a very neoliberal discourse that is completely trying to destroy the little social things that were completely protected or supported by these ideals of republicanism. So that's why we are facing this complexity, because the discourses that are used to sometimes target some people, to target the minorities, are also contradictory discourses.
Another form of aporia.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Now,
guys, I think maybe we'll start to wind down, but maybe before we close, I can ask a question on behalf of my good friend Omar Barada, who is asking. Hi Omar, long time no see.
My daughter is crying
heavily.
It's on time. It's 7 years, okay.
Who asks regarding Yala's notion of racial hospitality. Omar is curious how that plays outside of the in brackets hexagonal France-USA axis. For instance, when Yala goes in brackets back to the Congo, or Claire to Guadeloupe.
I think there is this question is important because it shows how there is no, so we have racism, and at the second time you have the way, for example, the so-called Black people have used the term Black and how they did reinvent themselves through this term. And I think that the way Black people use the term Black is not identical. I mean, there are several expressions of Blackness, and this is really important. And there is another question, I think another issue that complexify the question of Blackness is the question of hybridity or métissage. And I am métis, and sometimes in France, people don't see, I was never considered as a métis, but as a Black person. But when I go back in the Congo, I am not considered as a Black person, but as a white person, which is, it was completely shocking for me the first time it happened. And it was, I think, one of the most experience of my life, of the worst, experience of my life. One thing is, okay, I am a white in the Congo because I come from Europe, and I can try to explain it geopolitically. And you forget that and you say, okay, I'm going to be just the real Black in France, and that's all. Or it was interesting for me not to erase this experience of being called as white, because it shows something about métissage, the complexity of the question of métissage in the ancient colonial African colonies, that is not the same as what happened, for example, in the Americas. This is not the same history of métissage. And it shows that also race is, even if it is true in our life, it is still a fiction, and I am not Black everywhere. And what does this mean about racial order and the way the question of race is always linked to the question of territory. You cannot think about race without linking this question to the question of the territory and also of the memories of hate. What kind of hate has shaped this territory of Central Africa, of Republic Democratic of Congo, so that one of those children, like me, can be called as white, that is to say, has the people who have colonized this country. And this is those questions that are really interesting for me. So I would say there is no racial hospitality for me because I am not considered as Black by the Black Congolese, but I am not considered as white in this country by the white people that are living in this country. So it's interesting to see how all those things are linked together and how they are completely complexifying this question of race. And we also have to understand racism by linking this question to the issue of colorism. And I think that in France, we don't think a lot about the issues of colorism and the fact that the strict color are you, comment on dit Claire? Are you clear?
Yeah, light skin.
Are you light skinned or dark skinned? How it's redefine the way the toxicity of racism and the toxicity sometimes of racial categories that we also use sometimes to just free ourselves.
On this topic, but also to answer some of the questions that I'm just taking notice on. On the screen, the racial experience you're describing are very similar to mine. I was also called white in Nigeria, much to my shock. But I also understood that Nigerians would call white any person who is not black. It is not about being a lighter skinned black person of mixed origin. It is about being not black. And so it's interesting because whiteness becomes otherness, in much the way that blackness is otherness to predominantly white countries. That's just one thing. As far as the matter of colorism is concerned, and just briefly, but to go back to this French-American, the Americas linkage we're trying to make, it does very much exist in the US as it does in France, especially if I am to compare a Caribbean experience with a Southern American experience. As a Guadeloupean who came to know all the different, the terminology linked to the different shades of darkness, and in the way in which we know the casta system to have also existed in the Spanish or Portuguese word, I was very much at home in New Orleans, where I spent the better part of my American experience of late, because I could find the same racial categories within the Creole society there. So I think, and in the US, we have terms like high yellow or red or this and that and the other, and there are similar terms in the French context. So that's something. But to go back to the theorization of matters to do with diasporic questions, because in a way I prefer to, or I want to sidestep the notion of race with what the great Brent Edward Hayes referred to as the practice of diaspora. And there, Omar, you have a great example of what racial hospitality could be. And it was the great salons convened by Suzanne Césaire and all the women from the negritude movement. So a practice of diaspora, rather than the discourse on race, is maybe that which we should be, well, which in a way we are working on in our daily existence. We are practicing diaspora, we are diaspora. But also I want to, for the sake of being true to our academic, to the academic setting in which we are, Brian, you're asking, this is the great book, Anne Lafont, L'art et la race, l'Africain tout contre l'œil des Lumières. And I lost my page on Toussaint, but just get the book, and also be aware that Anne is the recipient of a Clark Fellowship at Williams College. So she's presently in the US. She is on sabbatical as a Clark Fellow. But Anne is really not to be missed. This is one of the greatest books of art history I have read in a long time, period. This is not about being a Black art historian. This is not about working on Black art history. It is just astounding as a piece of art history. So that's the reference, Brian.
Thanks so much, you guys. I want to be conscientious of your time and commitments to family and children. I'm sorry to the members of the audience who have asked questions in the meantime. I think we're just running out of time, and maybe we can find a way to ask them again. On behalf of the department and Stephen, the chair, and the audience, Yala, Claire, thank you so much. This was really wonderful.
Thank you. And just quickly, hi, Victor. We'll continue the conversation. We'll resume our conversation, rather. Sorry, just noticing a member of the audience I know, Victor Power. Yeah.
Yes, and thank you for.
Thank you so much
for hosting us.
Thank you, Stephen.
I just want to say and to thank you again, Brian, because you accepted the fact that I was just a young mother, that I had a 7 weeks child here, and you accepted this situation, and it's really important to notice that in the academic world. Thank you.
And thank you for your virtuosity in making it happen. Also, I know it's a tough time also, and a wonderful time.
Yeah. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Claire.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
It was
Merci.
a pleasure.
A great pleasure. Oui, merci.
Okay.
Merci, au revoir.
Merci.